Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My guess is that many of you are here tonight because you're still processing the historic election and Trump's rise from candidate to president-elect and now to president. I'm sure there are many questions you still have about his unprecedented rise to power, as well as some of his first decisions that he has made while in office. My name is Rachel Fox, and I work with the Academic Programs Department here at the American Enterprise Institute. I would like to welcome you here and thank you for coming, and thank our partners at the Foundation for Constitutional Government for helping make this event possible. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce our two guests for the evening, AEI's Charles Murray and the Weekly Standard's Bill Kristol. Both have analyzed this election cycle and are here tonight to offer their insights into this election and what it means for the future of politics in America. Charles Murray is the W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. A political scientist, author, and libertarian, he first came to national attention in 1984 with the publication of Losing Ground, which has been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1966. Dr. Murray is also the author of The Bell Curve, What It Means to be a Libertarian, Human Accomplishment, In Our Hands, Real Education, By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission, and of course, the New York Times bestseller, Coming Apart, which will be the foundation for our conversation tonight. Joining him is Bill Kristol, who is the founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard and a political analyst for ABC News. He is the host of Conversations with Bill Kristol, which features in-depth discussions with some of America's leading thinkers and figures in public life. Kristol is a regular on ABC's This Week and on ABC's special events and election coverage, and also appears frequently on other leading political commentary shows. Before starting the Weekly Standard in 1995, Kristol led the Project for the Republican Future, where he helped shape the strategy that produced the 1994 Republican congressional victory. Before coming to Washington in 1985, Kristol was on the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, Charles Murray and Bill Kristol will have some time to share their thoughts, then they'll open up the floor to any questions from the audience. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Rachel, and it's good to be here. I'm going to just toss some softball questions to Charles, and he'll hit them out of the park, and everyone will be happy, so that'll be good. I would just add one thing to Rachel's introduction of Charles. I really do think he is the leading social scientist in America. I mean, combining a careful attention to data and detail with an interest in coming to interesting and broad and thought-provoking conclusions. I don't know if I would have said that Charles was the leading social scientist in America before when the late James Q. Wilson was still alive, or the late Sam Huntington, to mention two of my teachers. But honestly, that generation has passed or is passing. Charles, luckily, is very much with us and writing very productively, and so it's really a great honor to be here with Charles. I'll just say one more thing. Rachel mentioned the conversations that I do online. There actually are two with Charles Murray, which I highly recommend. They're not that different in form from this conversation here, just the two of us talking for about an hour and a half. One other thing the Foundation for Constitutional Government, which is the co-sponsor with AEI of this event, does is we have websites devoted to both great thinkers and contemporary thinkers, and we just recently got up a website devoted to Charles Murray. So if you go to contemporarythinkers.org, you can see you can have a very accessible guide to Charles Murray's writings, his video of his appearances, and so forth. So I recommend that if this stimulates you to go back, as it should, and read Charles's books, essays, articles, reviews of Charles's books, attacks on Charles, whatever you want.
No, you don't have to read those. Stop with the books.
I mean, really, very few social science. Just one last point, since so many of you weren't even born, I suppose, when Charles first made a big impact in the 80s with Losing Ground. I mean, that book was a huge. I was teaching at the Kennedy School at the time. They couldn't ignore it. It had a huge effect. In the 90s, The Bell Curve, In Pursuit of Happiness. Shortly after that, I think, was that early in the next decade. Obviously, Coming Apart in 2012. I mean, there's no other, I believe, social scientist or really maybe public intellectual in America who's sort of consistently produced such thought-provoking and important books, and really not on the same topic. A lot of people do very good work, and then they do the same good work over and over again. These are really on very different topics. So enough effusive talk about Charles Murray.
You've really set me up.
It's gone to his head, right? He'll have trouble talking here. Yeah. He's very... I thought maybe contrary to what Rachel said, we won't begin with the election if you want and the current moment, since I think we're both somewhat bewildered by it probably. And also because I think your comparative advantage, if I can say, is the broader scale of things. I think you should say a word. Not everyone here probably has read Coming Apart. A word about the book, a word about the reaction to the book, and then maybe we'll get to some of these deeper and broader trends that you've thought a lot about and are working on now.
Well, the Coming Apart, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's sort of like, I was lucky. I wanted to analyze some of the problems that I saw of a cultural cleavage in the United States with a new upper class, an elite, which saw itself as an elite, which is unusual in American history. That's not the way Americans were supposed to be. You weren't supposed to get too big for your britches. And we also had a new lower class that was different from the working class of the past. It had not just people who weren't working because they couldn't find jobs because the economy was bad. You had people dropping out of the labor force, working-aged, healthy males dropping out of the labor force. You had growing births to single women, and at a level which was unheard of. And I wanted to not get caught up in all of the racial, ethnic confounds with this. So I said, well, I'm just going to analyze data for non-Latino whites. It'll make it much clearer that these problems are not ones that are grounded in race. They exist across the culture. Well, it turned out it was a very opportune time to analyze what was going on with working class whites, as well as the new upper class, which is overwhelmingly white. And it highlighted what surfaced last year in the election, a very strong disaffection by the white working class toward the new upper class, fueled in large part, in substantial part, by the open contempt and disdain that the new upper class has for the working class, and especially for the white working class, and most especially for the male white working class. So I was in the unusual position as the campaign proceeded last year of being, along with Bill, a never-Trumper, and yet feeling great sympathy for the energy of Trumpism. The problem, though, even though I think the anger and the issues were legitimate, is that, and I bet Bill, I want to keep this a conversation, by the way. When we have an audience,
I'm usually such a shrinking violet, but I'll have to make myself talk.
Bill, I think you would agree that you and I found ourselves, starting in the early part of last year, at least me, with the realization a whole lot fewer people were committed to the same kinds of old-fashioned American creedal principles than I had thought there were previously. That go for you?
Yeah, I mean, it turned out that the upper, let's say, fashionable liberal upper class, progressive upper class, I think is the right way to say it, was not so committed to the old-fashioned principles of liberal democracy. They believe in historical progress, so they weren't so keen on limited government, the rule of law. All those things are kind of secondary for them. Certainly American leadership in the world, American exceptionalism, which you've written about. And then it turned out the working class, white working class especially, was susceptible to what's now being called a Jacksonian, but let's say a nationalist, populist type of appeal. A lot of it, I do think, based on anxiety and resentments, maybe legitimate anxiety and legitimate resentments, but not with much of a positive vision. And in my opinion, and I think we agreed on this, not policies that probably won't really help much. And so sort of, let's call it old-fashioned liberal with a little L, conservative in the modern American context, perhaps, belief in the Constitution, limited government, American world leadership, did not have much of a constituency.
Yeah.
In the general election, at least, and that's, things change. Maybe it'll have a comeback, but no. Okay, so
no.
Charles told me he's going to be. Yeah, this is okay.
Yeah.
So I think the interesting thing is, I mean, a lot of people have analyzed the psychology of this, but you actually looked at the data. I mean, you were worried before Trump appeared about the actual lives of the working class and the white working class, right? I mean, that's the most striking thing about the book, isn't it? I mean.
Well, I'm not sure that's more striking than the distinctiveness of the new upper class culture.
Okay, so those two things.
Yeah, but let me just sort of put some kind of conclusion on this part of the conversation by saying that I think that what we have witnessed over the last year is essentially the divestment of the American population from the creedal principles. And by that I mean, in the 19th century and into the 20th century, there really was a kind of American creed that was broadly accepted across political lines, bitter though the partisan disputes were during the 19th century. I mean, you have all sorts of testimony to that, Tocqueville being, of course, famous. By loyalty to creedal principles, I mean things like Tocqueville's famous passage where he says, you talk to anybody, rich or poor, and they're constantly yammering at you, not the word he used, they're constantly bringing up self-interest rightly understood. And it's explaining to you that for them to pursue their own prosperity leads ineluctably. They were picking up from Adam Smith, and this is what everybody thought. There was a well-known British social historian who was the leading expert on the United States at the end of the 19th century, saying the same thing, that in conversations with Americans, here are the things that they always end up talking about. You ought to be able to keep what you make. You ought to be able to free to do whatever you want. The less government, the better. All government should be put down at the lowest level. This was not partisan stuff. And so even as recently as the 1940s, Gunnar Myrdal was the guy who used the American creed as a way of framing what he saw going on. Then, as far as I'm concerned, that lasted up to the early 1960s. The most liberal politician in America in 1964, I think it's fair to say, was Hubert Humphrey, in terms of principled liberalism. He was devoted to the individualism and opportunity and egalitarianism in the old-fashioned sense of that word. He's the guy who stood in the Capitol steps and said that people ought to have the right to hire or fire for any reason or no reason, as long as it wasn't race. And so you had that kind of consensus. The left pulled away from that in the subsequent decades almost completely. Then the white working class, which started to vote Republican in the 1980s, they were never creedal Republicans, and they finally become disillusioned, and in a sense they reveal their true colors. And so I think that what we have seen is not reversible. The American creed, the American way of life, was a very historically peculiar thing. And it was unnatural that we had it for as long as we had. I don't think it's ever coming back.
Okay, well, we can go get drinks now. And, yeah. I'm kind of it's always darkest before the dawn kind of guy, so I think these things, maybe Obama was the dead end of progressivism, Trump will be the dead end of a kind of populism, and then there'll be a revival of interest in what you couldn't call it the American creed, or let's just call it the kind of basics of modern liberal democracy. That's my view. Charles is more of a, it's always darkest before it turns pitch black type of guy. That's probably truer as an analytical matter. I believe, it turns pitch black. But anyway, so yeah, that's a little worrisome. It was an unusual campaign. I think one reason it was an unnerving campaign in 2016. And the way I put it was at the end of the campaign when there were three candidates left, Sanders, Clinton, and Trump. If you had come down from Mars and looked at that campaign, you would have said it was a socialist who proudly said he hadn't changed his views about anything in 50 years, had gone to Cuba and Soviet Union, and didn't see much wrong with them, and in any case really strongly believed in the economics of socialism. We had a kind of authoritarian populist demagogue, I would say, preying on people's anxieties. That's Trump. And then we had Hillary Clinton, a very kind of family that had done well in politics, that was trying to hand down the presidency from the husband to the wife, that had gotten rich through political connections. If you'd come down from Mars and looked at that race, you would have said, oh yeah, that's Argentina. I mean, literally, that's what a third world country looks like. The socialist, the authoritarian populist, who's often a rich celebrity who takes advantage of that, and the insider family that gets rich off politics and tries to kind of hand the high offices back and forth among themselves. And that's one thing Americans prided themselves on, was not being like these kind of third world quasi-democracies. We had the rule of law, we had a whole different way of set of beliefs and a set of institutions and principles. And in that respect, I think your 2016 is unnerving if you, in a way that the other elections weren't. You could dislike the candidates, you could say Obama, Bush, Romney, whatever, or weren't perfect. But in a way, those were traditional American choices between a liberal, sometimes a moderate liberal, sometimes a fairly liberal, and a conservative of some kind, in a way that I think Sanders, Clinton, Trump really wasn't. And now we have an experiment with the Trump presidency that we'll see how that goes. After an experiment with an Obama presidency that was really different, I would say, somewhat different, less dramatically than Trump, in kind from the preceding liberal presidencies. Certainly in the 90s, everyone thought Clinton, the third way, that's the wave of the liberal future. That turned out not to be true, right? So,
I really like the third world country comparison, but let me give you another one. In what sense does Washington today, in operational terms, differ from a third world kleptocracy in the way it operates? And I say in functional terms. I'm not saying that the current representatives and senators are more venal or more corrupt. I am saying that to get anything done, it requires essentially the same kind of, if you substitute for the word bribe, campaign contributions and so forth. And I would also argue, and I guess I'm not going to try to make that case here, I wrote about it in a book called By the People at more length, it's qualitatively different. That what happened in the 1970s with the rise of the lobbying industry, and oddly enough, the lobbying industry was really quite small before then, again, it's not a matter of dishonesty, it's a matter of a structural kind of corruption that is deeply embedded now, and I don't see how you get back out of that one either.
I guess the counter-argument would be that actually, but there has been a reaction to that, certainly intellectually. I mean, there are now many, many more lawyers and judges and potential judges who have really internalized and thought through the arguments against this, let's call it the administrative state and its various permutations, and why that's so damaging, not just to economic well-being, but to liberty, to self-government. I think in political philosophy even there's sort of a revival of interest in this. Some of the younger members of the House and the Senate seem to have a greater taste maybe for a revival of constitutionalism and old-fashioned liberalism than would have been the case 30 or 40 years ago. So maybe that's the counter trend.
Okay, I won't push that.
But at this point, it's a minority counter trend. Okay. I will agree with that. And so one other argument, and this I think touches on things you've thought a lot about, is that, well, technology's in our favor. The iPhone, it's not the big centralized things that work well. It's the things that clearly were formed out of the freest parts of our free market, mostly, in Silicon Valley, with a lot of failure and a lot of experimentation, a lot of creative destruction, a lot of actually free trade in terms of imports and exports. And that, you can stand against that for a while, but don't people eventually realize that that is the way medicine's going to get better in the future, the way education's going to get better in the future? And we can argue endlessly about details, and this is too flip, but it's to somehow be more like the iPhone and less like 1930s central planning. I do that, and I think even young people, I think, have a certain appreciation for that. So that would be my sort of optimistic medium-term view.
I think even long-term, I'm optimistic in one sense. I think that a great deal of what's going on empowers individuals in ways that we've never known before. All sorts of centralized institutions are not nearly as important as they used to be. Lots of people have written about this. We've all experienced it, whether it's the fragmentation of, or I should say the opening up of access to the internet. But for that matter, there are people in this audience who have no idea what it's like to live at a time where you could not instantly get the answer to any factual question that crosses your mind within a matter of seconds. I mean, that is such a transformative thing, and it's emblematic of a much broader set of ways in which, for a lot of us, it's a wonderful new world of possibilities. I also think that things like body cameras for police and other kinds of surveillance, if you want to use that term, is going to in many ways be a positive thing in terms of we don't need nearly as much centralized institution as we used to need, because there's it's sort of like Uber on a great scale, where you have to be, you rate each other. And so all of that's good. Guess who that mostly benefits? Mostly benefits us, people like us. And it is not nearly as relevant, although it is somewhat relevant, to a guy who's working construction and trying to make a living. Then, however, if you talk about technology, you've got the flip side. And here is, am I being a Luddite when I say that we're facing a huge problem? Everybody says this to me, that you guys have been saying for 200 years that technology is going to destroy jobs, and it's always worked out fine. Well, it's not just that 4 million truck driver and car driver jobs are going to go away within 10 or 15 years. It's the middle class, white collar jobs. I mean, think about, now you can still make money if you're a really great lawyer, because we live in a litigious world with very complex laws. There are all sorts of ways to make lots of money if you're a lawyer, but now you have to bring to that lawyering a lot of very high level of skill. Because you know what? A great deal of what lawyers do is very tedious, and it involved going through precedents, it involved combing through law books, it involved lots of paralegals. A lot of that's gone away already. And artificial intelligence is in the process of making decisions that are as accurate as people make, as accountants, as paralegals, as you name it. Just this very broad range of white-collar jobs that, if they don't go away completely, are going to be reduced. And I think it is not, the new jobs that will be created, guess who they're going to benefit? Tyler Cowen, the economist, has written a very good book called Average is Over. And he makes the point that the people who will prosper are those people who can interact with computers, so that the combination of what the computer can do and what the human can do is better than either separately. Well, guess what class of people benefits from that? So I think we're looking at a down the road, not that many years away, maybe a couple of decades, a massive change in the labor force that has massive social implications if a job as historically understood is not available to a lot of people.
And it particularly disadvantages the less well-educated,
Yeah.
or those able to be,
Yeah.
and those less able to be well-educated, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so the Luddites, just for people who don't, and it's a term it was used so much in our younger years. I don't know, I guess it's still used. So Mr. Ludd, was an English character who hated the Industrial Revolution and destroyed plants somewhere. What was it, like 1810-ish, something like that? I don't know.
They were milling.
Someone could look this up, but anyway. And of course, they're made fun of subsequently by all historians, and especially economists, because how foolish were they? They didn't see that, of course, you can have a huge diminution in the number of people working in satanic mills or in coal mines or in, on agriculture, and their jobs come back and they're better and they're richer, later on in first in industrial manufacturing, and then later on in service economy, and blah, blah, blah. So it all progresses happily forward. But as a friend of mine pointed out, I mean, those 30, 40 years between 1810 and 1850
were no fun.
Yeah, there was a very rough years in European history. I mean, the British made it through, as they always seem to, without having an actual revolution. Almost everyone else in Europe had one. The British had a lot of turmoil. It wasn't, very easy making the transition from agriculture to industrial, and then, of course, where to look at accounts of the early 20th century when they're making the next transition. Those are not easy times politically, and you get one bad recession or depression, and you get things that happened in Germany and Italy and so forth. So, I mean, it really is, things can come out at the end of this okay, and you can still go through a very, very tough challenge in the middle of it. Maybe that's what we're beginning. I mean,
but there's something else that, and again, Tyler Cowen is the one who suggested this to me, but as soon as I read it, I said, of course. And he said it's going to be especially hard on guys, because there are a couple of things to be said here. One is, what jobs are going to be the last to be automated? And those are personal service jobs of the form of nannies, of caring for small children, and a whole bunch of people caring for geezers like me as we get older. And what you need as the job qualifications are not a high IQ necessarily. The overriding thing you want is conscientiousness. So that even though nobody's looking over your shoulder, the person caring for the geriatric crowd is going to do the right thing. Men and women have different profiles of conscientiousness for doing that kind of thing, and women come out way ahead. And guys don't do nearly as well in that. There are just lots of ways, and I wanted to then add something else. We have a problem of crumbling social capital. We can come back to why we have that. But there are all sorts of ways in which, as Bob Putnam at Harvard has documented Bowling Alone, and subsequently in which we are coming unraveling in terms of the social capital in our communities. And there's lots of work to be done. There's plenty of work to be done. I have a wife who is full-time building social capital. She's not getting paid a nickel for it, but she's putting in her 40 or 50 hours a week. That's great. And in one sense, if you have lots of jobs that have gone away, there's lots of things for people to do, even though they are not traditionally paid work. But males have been socialized for decades or centuries now to think of a job as a thing you do for pay, and it has certain kinds of structure, which is not going to characterize the work that needs to be done in not very many years.
I mean, it seems to me in your book the most striking for me suggestion was the combination of the economics, the technology replacing, in a sense, manual labor, and even middle-class labor being called into question. The huge majority of these people driving trucks who presumably will be replaced or needed less because of self-driving trucks and cars are men, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
the huge majority, obviously, of people in the coal mines, which are not going to come back, despite Trump's promises, I'm going to predict, are men, et cetera. So male jobs, if one's permitted to say that anymore, or let's just say I'm not being normative, but what have historically been male jobs, go away a lot. And then if you combine that with the social capital discussion you have in the book, which I think is worth going through quickly. I mean, Pat Moynihan, whom we both knew, I worked for once, wrote his famous Report on the Negro Family, that's what it was called then, in 1965, hugely controversial, in which he said, look, the Civil Rights Revolution is great, it's unbelievably admirable that Negroes, as they were called then, blacks, African Americans, went through slavery, went through discrimination, horrible discrimination after slavery, Jim Crow and all that, and kept their family together. I mean, under unbelievable duress, including literally having families broken up by having slaves sold and so forth. But in fact, it was an amazing success story of a group of Americans. Finally, they were getting full equality, or beginning to get full equality, and that was a great thing. And Moynihan was one of the first to say, but what's happening? What's happening is that unfortunately in the black family, we now have 25%, I think that was the number that Pat focused on in 65, illegitimacy rate, out of wedlock birth rate, and that's dangerous. And Moynihan said at the time, we don't know how a society works when 25% of the kids are being brought up in homes with only one parent and almost always without the father, and especially how the boys do without a male role model at home. Now the overall out-of-wedlock birth rate is 40%. And among whites, it's what, a 33 or something
Well,
like?
yeah, see, the thing is, you have a huge class divide here.
Yeah, so talk about that.
If you
anyway, but among whites, it's higher than it was among blacks when Moynihan was alarmed.
We're way past where they were in 1964. By we're past, I mean the white birth rate is out of wedlock birth rate is much higher. This is something that seems to be ineluctable, and it's not really a controversial statement. Communities fall apart when marriage falls apart. And I'm not going to go into arguments about whether this is evolutionarily foreordained, that human beings are hardwired this way versus socialization. I am just saying, as an empirical fact, there is no such thing, to my knowledge, as an example of a vibrant, functioning community in which half the kids only have one parent. that everywhere you have communities in that situation, you see the kind of disintegration of social capital that we've been talking about. Now compare, and I'm talking exclusively about non-Latino whites now. Compare what's going on in the upper middle class of white America and the working class of white America. In the upper middle class, which I define as people who have college degrees and are working in either a managerial or a professional job or are married to such a person, the out-of-wedlock birth rate is around single digits. It might be 10 or 11, 12% at this point. The overwhelming proportion of children are still being born to two-parent families. The divorce rate, which skyrocketed during the 1970s, stabilized for the upper middle class. About more than 80% of all non-Latino whites in the upper middle class are not only married, they are, most of them are in first marriage because divorce has gone down as well. So marriage is alive and well, and actually communities are alive and well in the white upper middle class. In the white working class, and I'm talking about males ages 30 to 49, the ages at which being married is the norm, you're now down to about half of all white males who are married. And the proportion of children born to single women, it's 40% for the nation as a whole, roughly. It's closer to half or more in the white working class. So you can find it ideologically unpalatable to say this, but that means communities no longer function, and we do not know how to make communities function with any outside interventions.
Well, I discussed this with J.D. Vance, who wrote this best. He also meant to write a nice appreciation, and not just appreciation though, also criticism, I will say, or of the area he grew up in, a true account of what it was like to grow up in, I guess, first Kentucky and then Ohio, and he wrote this book, Hillbilly Elegy, which then became this kind of guide to the Trump voter. He was also against Trump, and he ended up being on TV all the time explaining Trumpism. And I was on a panel with him, actually, like this, and a discussion with him, and asked what could be done. And he's 31 years old, so he has fairly recent experience of a community like this, a tough life himself. He went to the Marine Corps right out of high school, and that was what really got him going in the right direction, and then went to Ohio State, and that was very successful. Went to Yale Law School, but I guess not everyone can go into the Marines, and I did say, honestly, I wonder if the single best thing you could do is double the size of the armed services. Well, why not? It's a very good discipline for them. They learned a trade. It's pretty cheap as these things go compared to a lot of social programs. But he was struck just in the years since he goes back and sees his family, of course, by for example, the opioid epidemic and the drugs use, which wasn't, he said, that great when he was growing up. The people in his family had problems with drugs, but it was a little bit unusual. And he says now, this is now skyrocketing, and no one really knows what to do about it.
We're not talking about the inner city either. It's not
right.
just that we're talking about small towns. And those of you in the audience who are older and grew up in small towns or small cities in the Midwest or the West or something, and if you have been back to those towns recently, and you went to whatever is the wrong side of the tracks in your town, believe me, you can get out of the car and go to the local coffee shop and talk to people. And the kinds of problems that I am referring to as the breakdown of social capital, they will describe to you in much more pungent terms than that as to how the community has changed. And the question here becomes, and I guess this is becoming a theme of my remarks, I don't see how you turn this around. I don't see how you take the institution of marriage and you have a set of cultural norms that, once again, are so strong that they do that strangest of all things, and that is get a male in his 20s to settle down and get serious and not do what he most yearns to do, which is to sow wild oats. And the way that happened in the past, was through the use of carrots and sticks. You did not become a fully grown man in American culture and most European cultures until you were married. Being married and having a family, taking care of a wife and children is what made you a man. And it was a rite of passage, and you got lots of social rewards for behaving that way. You got lots of social punishments for not behaving that way. It's really hard to see how anything like that kind of social pressure, that's the only word for it, ever comes back.
I mean, I guess one could argue in parts of Europe, Scandinavia, they have very low marriage rates now, but don't seem to have the same crisis of social capital, if that's the right way to describe it, that we have. I don't know if they do or don't. They still seem to have, I mean, one aspect of this, incidentally, is the decline, don't you think, I think you argued this, of social mobility. And I mean, you also get a society that's more bifurcated. And again, this may be due mostly to forces that are beyond anyone's control. But, you know, in the old days, it wasn't just that people were, there was more people moved from one class to the other, and therefore there was more sympathy, you might say, between classes than is the case today.
Well, I think Europe, I mean, we ought to look upon Europe as a canary in the coal mine on several dimensions. And one of them is what you just said, that you have formal marriage that has declined precipitously in lots of countries. You also have, in a place like Sweden, an awful lot of cohabitation goes on for years and years and years and years, and it has stability. However, there is also, just recently came out, a cross-national study of cohabitation in 55 different countries, and it is associated everywhere with greater instability than marriage as such. Europe is trying to do two things at the same time, and I think the jury's still out. One is, can you have a society for a long period of time in which the family, as more formally construed, is no longer the organizing unit for communities? And the other thing is, can you have, for a long period of time, a very secular society? Is secular humanism good enough as a kind of glue? Both of these don't really have historical precedents. We don't have a good empirical record on how long this can go on. I will say diffidently, because this is not a specialty of mine, that there are signs of growing problems, even in Scandinavian countries. But just to complete my wellspring of pessimism, you also have greater ethnic heterogeneity in those countries. And so independently of whether they could have sustained this kind of thing indefinitely, given ethnically homogeneous cultural homogeneity and so forth, they now have a problem that was also brought to attention by Bob Putnam. He wasn't the first person to discover it, but he was the first person to make it more widely known. And that is that social trust, which is an absolute key for social capital, declines in ethnically heterogeneous communities. Again, it's one of these things we wish weren't so, but it does seem to be so, and so you have European countries that are having to cope with that as well. But the jury is still out. We don't know what's going to happen.
I mean, I guess the other way, or a further problem would be this: even if Europe, speaking very broadly here, were to succeed more or less in maintaining a very good standard of living and reasonably low crime rates, and let's just stipulate that maybe the terrorism problem is manageable and so forth. And so they're in a moderately stable, moderately decadent, quite well off, pleasant, declining population in many cases, but gradually declining, and they're not going to be invaded by anyone soon. So presumably they can put up with that for a few generations. Even if that were to work in Europe, you know, in the sense that it's not manifestly falling apart, what would that mean if the U.S. went down that road? I mean, the U.S. has had for 70 years a distinctive role in the world, which Europe has been gradually ceding to the U.S. And if the U.S. becomes even the sort of optimistic version of Europe, it seems to me the future of the world in the 21st century looks very different, because for America to be the leader of the world in terms of alliances and all kinds of other things probably requires more than just kind of hanging on, which I think is sort of, I think the optimistic version of Europe is that they're going to hang on to what they have now, which is pretty good by the standards of all of human history. That's a pretty nice life they have, but it's still not enough to actually shape no one thinks Europe is going to shape the 21st century, right? Europe has very little influence outside Europe and declining.
The interesting thing one of the interesting things about the times in which we live is that we can know for sure that there are more huge changes coming down the road within the lifetime of most of the people in this room. And something that for those of you who are under the age of 40, let's say, is harder for you to see than it is for people my age, is the speed with which life has changed over the last 25 years. The way I lived in the early 1980s was really extremely similar to the way that people lived in the early 1950s technologically. Yeah, the personal computer had just come on, and it was better than typewriters and so forth. But the real change in tech, the world you lived in was very similar. The world I live in now is utterly different from the world I lived in 1983 when I was working on Losing Ground. And the things that Bill and I have been talking about, what AI is going to do, artificial intelligence, the social changes that we know are going to happen because of the changes in family structure. It's not a question of these might happen and they might have big impacts. They will happen and they will have big impacts, but differential impacts on different parts of the society.
Well, maybe we can have some questions and answers that will cheer us up here. You look like a fairly cheerful group. I think we have a microphone. Is that right? So if you raise your hand, I'll recognize you. And we've got about half an hour here for Q&A, and then of course the reception. I hope hard liquor is being served at this reception, since I certainly need a drink after this. I mean, someone asked a question. Don't be embarrassed here. How about up here in the front? There. Oh, you got a mic here. Okay, good. Well, I don't need a mic, but.
Question for Dr. Murray. The problems you documented with the working class and coming apart all seem to kind of coincide with the increase in immigration to America, post-1965 immigration. The communities most affected by that were working class communities because that's who they ended up living with. It was a very astute point that Scandinavia has had family breakdown, but yet hasn't suffered the same decline in social capital. So I'm wondering if what's actually at play here is an immigration question, and that would obviously tie into this election as well.
The immigration issue is very germane to all of this. Now, the effects of the immigration are, I think, I think the statistics give a misleading impression. The statistics are that Latinos are now 16% of the population, blacks are about 13% of the population, Asians about 5%, and non-Latino whites are proportionally much lower. That is not the case that's not evenly throughout the country. So, for example, if you go to J.D. Vance's Ohio towns, and for that matter, if you go to a very broad spectrum of cities outside the megalopolises across what I would call the northern tier of states, the ethnic composition is very similar to what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And where you've seen the real change are in the megalopolises, which are truly multi-ethnic in a way they were not 50 years ago. And you have also seen an awful lot of the concentration of Latino immigration in the Southwest, plus New York and a couple other major cities. So, point number one is the United States is not multicultural across the board in the way that a lot of people sort of loosely characterize it. Now, having said that, is it the case, and this is part of the anger, remember what I just said about ethnic heterogeneity reduces social trust. It not only reduces social trust of one ethnic group for another, it reduces social trust within ethnic groups. So in a Latino, non-Latino white community, non-Latino whites don't trust each other as much as they used to, and neither do the Latinos trust each other as much. And it was working class Americans who bore the brunt of that kind of unasked for ethnic heterogeneity. The upper middle class, the elites especially, not just the upper middle class, but the people at the top, live in neighborhoods that are exactly the way they want them to be. And that ethnicity is not a big deal there, because if you have an African American neighbor, he's an orthopedic surgeon, and what's the problem there? And that disparity, where elite America was able to avoid any of the costs of immigration, whereas working class America was not able to avoid those costs, is a source of a great deal of the anger. And I will just add parenthetically that the one thing that I really changed my view on over the course of last year, I never warmed to Donald Trump, and I have still not warmed to Donald Trump. I have warmed to the idea that we as Americans owe an obligation to our fellow Americans that should, I want to say Trump, that should take priority over our loyalty to the world's population and globalization. And so I'm in favor of limiting low-skill immigration in a way that I was not in favor of it before, prompted in part by the kinds of issues implicit in your question.
I mean, I would say, if I could just say, I've actually sort of gone the opposite way on immigration, which I suppose means I'm wrong. Charles is right. But so, I mean, I've been moderately liberal to moderately conservative. I didn't like the Gang of Eight bill and stuff, so I'm not a dogmatic, open borders person. And I agree. I mean, it's an empirical question in some sense, whether we should have 1.5 million legal immigrants or 2 million or 1 million. It's foolish to make it a test of how decent a person one is or how much one believes in the Statue of Liberty or something like that. That's silly. Having said that, I would just put on the Trump phenomenon, you know, he did better in working class areas that have less immigration. Now, you can make a fancy argument, I guess, that they were still offended because they had to hit 1 instead of 2 on their phone to get English rather than Spanish, or that they didn't like other aspects. I'm not minimizing that they read about what immigrants were doing in the Southwest and they were offended by it. But as an actual factual matter, it's where the social capital is collapsing in old towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Minnesota, where Trump did quite well, incidentally. There just aren't that many immigrants. There aren't that many low-skilled immigrants in those places. There are some pockets. Somalis in Minnesota are a big problem, and it is a problem. I don't mean to minimize it. But so I'm a little dubious, actually, about the whole immigration claim. Trump thinks trade was more important for him than immigration, and I kind of think that's right. I mean, if you're unemployed, or if you're a 52-year-old steelworker in Scranton, you think, I think you're wrong, but you think that it was NAFTA or maybe the opening up of the markets to China that ruined your future. And of course, it's true in some cases, but more broadly, I don't think it's true. But anyway, I don't even see how you could talk yourself into thinking that a big influx of immigrants into southern Arizona and Texas and southern California and pockets in North Carolina and other places really ruined your life. I don't mean to minimize their anxiety or their unhappiness, and I'm not saying they don't think that, incidentally. I don't think it's a true analysis of the situation. And I've actually come the other way, which is, honestly, immigrants do have more of the old-fashioned American virtues than lots of old-fashioned Americans. And Charles qualified his comment by saying low-skilled immigrants, so he still wants to have the high-skilled immigrants, and I think there's a pretty big economic consensus that they are huge net contributors to the country, to the economy. I mean, if you got a degree coming from abroad at MIT and you stay here, you're going to end up paying more in taxes than you're going to draw down in social benefits. It's pretty hard to make the argument you're going to even damage social capital much. As Charles said, the African-American doctor next door could easily be a South Asian doctor or or an East Asian computer scientist or whatever. Lower skills are obviously more complicated. But even there, honestly, if I look around, if you care about it's still complicated here. You owe a lot to your fellow citizens, but also you owe a lot to the country as a whole. And there, I just think empirically the case for pretty strong levels of immigration is if you can select people a little better, make it a little less about family and a little more about work ethic somehow and striving to succeed. I could make a case for pretty strong liberal case, honestly, for immigration. And on trade, I think one can make a very strong empirical case. I think we agree on this, that trade has certainly helped the world a heck of a lot, helped bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty around the world, billions probably, and net helps America, which again, net doesn't mean that every place is helped. But I am worried that people, I'll say this here, are accommodating too much now to Trumpism or to the working class's anxieties and concerns. You know, you do as a politician have to worry about the country as a whole. And honestly, if free trade really is better for the country than various forms of protectionism, and if, and I would say this, these limited forms of protectionism Trump is toying with, that there's a non-trivial chance that accelerates into more protectionism and more genuine breakdown of the world trading order or the world geopolitical order, as with the Asian deal that Trump worked away from. I think politicians have to stand up a little more than they are right now, in both parties actually, to these sentiments. That was really startling in this last election. Hillary Clinton and Trump on stage, both repudiating a trade agreement. I'm sure it wasn't a perfect agreement. It may not even have been on net a terribly useful agreement. But it was negotiated by previous American presidents of both parties with the leaders of 11 democratic nations, I think it's 11, in Asia. Kind of an important thing. It's just as a matter of American leadership that you just don't cavalierly walk away with because it becomes unpopular. Hillary Clinton deserves more blame than Trump. Trump's always been against free trade. Hillary Clinton negotiates the thing and then pretends it's no good. But what does that say really about the future of American world leadership if no one out there thinks they can negotiate something that has bipartisan support, and that if there's a little bit of a wave of populist unhappiness, you're going to walk away from it? Immigration is more complicated, but for whatever it's worth, I've sort of become, look, to be totally honest, if things are so bad, as you say, with the white working class, don't you want to get new Americans in who aren't going to be, I'm serious. You can make a case that this is going on too long and this is too crazy probably, and I hope this thing isn't being videotaped or ever shown anywhere. Whatever tiny pathetic future I have is going to be totally collapsed. You can make a case that America has been great because every I think John Adams said this at the beginning, right? Basically, if you're in a free society, a capitalist thriving society, after 2, 3, 4 generations of hard work, everyone becomes kind of decadent, lazy, spoiled, whatever. And then luckily, you have these waves of people coming in from Italy and Ireland and Russia and now Mexico who really want to work hard and really want to succeed and really want their kids to live better lives than them and aren't sort of clipping coupons or hoping that they can hang on, and meanwhile, we grew up as spoiled kids and so forth. So in that respect, I don't know why this moment is that different from the early 20th century or the mid-19th century.
Somebody else a chance to ask a question at this point.
Don't you want to rebut me briefly, though? You want to say,
No.
Okay, next. That's enough. I'll be quiet now. Let's ask Charles. Anyway, I can't see where the mic is, but in the back there? Is that? Yeah, right in the back, gentlemen.
Thank you. As you mentioned, AI is going to continue to develop, and we'll see some further sector changes in the economy. How do you see the social welfare state, I guess, following or adjusting to manage those changes?
Well, it's really a problem if you are going to rely on jobs-based solutions, so that you say, oh, well, point number one, I think one of the most important economic facts of the last half century, last 30, 40 years, is that the upper echelons of society have captured all the economic growth in terms of their increases in income, and you have not seen real increases in household income for a very large chunk of the lower part of the distribution. That is a big deal. I can understand the economic reasons that it happened. I don't think it's the result of conspiracy or anything like that. We live in a world which, over the last century, increasingly rewards a specific skill set. That is known, I will say, the dreaded letters IQ. Being smart is worth a hell of a lot more money now than it was 100 years ago. And so you've got, and you have a self-identified libertarian saying this, we have got to have a way to get more of the wealth to the people in the lower half of the distribution who have been shut out from it. if you go with increases in the EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, or other kinds of things that are conditioned on a society in which there are jobs out there traditionally defined, you're going to have problems. You already have a very large chunk of the labor force, of the potential labor force, that are out of the labor market, even in good economic times. So that's the reason why I, for many years now, have advocated a universal basic income. Unfortunately, universal basic income, as soon as you say it, you can think of all sorts of reasons why it's a dumb idea. And if you're a libertarian, you back off in horror, unless you're Milton Friedman. But I think that it's going to have to be taken seriously in a world in which you have such a radically changed labor market, and in a world where I'm afraid the market is going to continue to reward one chunk of the population way, way more than any other chunk. That is, we have to have changes in the way that income gets distributed. That is just the result of changing facts on the ground. I guess I will appeal to John Maynard Keynes, who was accused of changing his position on something, and he said, when the facts change, I change my mind, sir. What do you do? And in terms of income distribution, we are facing a radically different situation from one that any country has ever faced.
This gentleman up here, maybe we can get some of the younger people here in the audience.
Thank you. In Coming Apart, you discussed the importance of religion to the communities that you analyzed. What do you think are the chances of some type of religious revival that we can't yet predict, bringing back together these communities that you say are coming apart and hopefully solving some of the many problems you identified with the fracturing of those communities? Thank you.
Well, in Coming Apart, I grasped at a straw, but it's a real historical straw, and that is the religious Great Awakenings that happened in the United States either 3 or 4 times, depending on which historian you read. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those, it's a very important part of American history that does not get much attention. But because of the religious Great Awakenings, which were social movements that sort of sprang out of nowhere in the first half of the 18th century, in the first half of the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, or the late 19th century. And in each case, they had profound social and economic effects. And, okay, let me put on my optimist's cap here.
This will be very short. 42 seconds
Okay.
now, okay.
There is a lot of residual affection for America traditionally conceived. There are lots of people, when you talk, as I did in Coming Apart, about the kinds of communities that were traditional American communities and the way we've lost that, and I talk to audiences about that, I get a lot of people who say, we want that back. When I talk to elite audiences, wealthy people, hedge fund managers, and the rest of it, and I talk to them about the bubble they live in that's separated from mainstream America, and I say, what about your kids? I get lots of heads nodding, because they're concerned that their children are growing up separated from an America that they still love. So if you have that kind of residual affection for it, if these things are being talked about, as they are being talked about now, this cultural divergence and so forth, it is not out of the question that you get kind of civic great reawakening. And for reasons I will not go into, I think that we're very likely to have actual religious reawakening as well, because I think the 20th century was anomalous. I think the degree to which intellectuals in the 20th century said, religion is for dummies, I think that was anomalous in human history, and I think that there's lots of reasons to be hopeful there. If I were a betting person, but let's not say that. Let's just say it's a non-trivially greater than zero chance that you can have that kind of civic great awakening.
And does church attendance or religiosity of some kind correlate does it preserve more social capital these days? But sometimes you hear,
Oh boy.
Don't you sometimes hear people on the left sort of mocking, the states that have the highest out of wedlock birth rate, or red states where people are professedly more religious and so forth? You do get that?
Well, yeah, but here I will refer them to a good liberal with impeccable credentials, and that's Robert Putnam. In bowling alone, by his calculations, which nobody has ever disputed, half of all social capital is directly generated through religion. And then you get lots more social capital generated by religious people because they tend to be more civically involved than others. No, the decline in religiosity, which oddly enough has been much greater in the working class than in the upper middle class. So that startled me. I did not expect to find that. The decline in religiosity is very closely related to the decline in social capital. Of course, the breakdown of marriage, they're all intertwined in many ways.
Next question. Right here, this young lady here. Yeah.
Hi, so I wanted to bring it back to the question about what if a job is historically understood is not available, because I think this is something that we're going to have to struggle with in the long term and come up with bipartisan solutions in order to get to a place that we actually deal with the real social problems there. And it was said kind of flippantly, let's expand the military. But I think in some ways a volunteer military is the new coal mine. Men largely risk their lives in order to get a stable paycheck, right? But the problem with it is it's not in place. It's not in the communities in the way it was, and we need something, I think, that actually solves the problems in place. So I'm curious what people think about the idea of widespread paid public service. So I think this solves some of the problems we're talking about in terms of investing in improving community, building authentic solidarity, and what we just said here about the civic reawakening. So thoughts about that?
So this is a larger military or national service?
No,
or
national public service, not military.
Okay. Okay, now I think you have to look at the track record. The military has been able in the past to take draftees who did not want to be in the military at all and has made them into competent soldiers who obey orders. But you see, the military has the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You do not say to the drill sergeant, no, I don't feel like it today, without drastic consequences. Public service, civilian public service programs will not be administered in that way, I guarantee you. I was in Peace Corps back in the thousands of years ago, in the 1960s, and of course Peace Corps was a volunteer organization, but I tell you, there was going to be none of the kind of, if you had people who didn't want to be there, what's going to happen is what happened with a program called the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, which was a huge jobs program in the 1970s, which is people learned how to game the system. And you won't have drastic penalties. Yet people will learn how to show up for a sufficient amount of time to punch their ticket. In a way, I think it'll make people more cynical about public service than otherwise. I'm not against it in principle, in theory. I am saying as a public administration matter, it's not going to work.
I suppose things like Teach for America and other things that one has in mind are mostly taken advantage of by upper middle class kids who are probably going to be fine anyway. And so the big advantage of the military and the enlisted especially, but it is that you really do get kids who might not have otherwise been okay and hopefully make them okay, though not all of them, obviously. And incidentally, the draft didn't work so well. That's why the military wanted to go to a volunteer military in 1970, 71. It wasn't, just... So, I mean, it is, I'm personally quite sympathetic in principle to the idea of thinking about ways to do that. And having said that, it's hard to, in practice, exactly know how to do that. And there are some examples from abroad which look good on the surface. When you look more deeply, like at Germany and stuff, I'm not sure that they think that that's don't they serve, I think it is 9 months or something like that, and mostly in some kind of volunteer public service type job. I'm not sure how much they think it really lasts or changes people, but it would be worth. I do think generally in a new era you do need, as Charles says, to think innovatively, and it probably means some liberals are going to have to think about more conservative things, and some conservatives are going to have to think about what previously they would have resisted in terms of public policy. A couple more questions? Back there, yes, sir. Let's take two at once. I know this young lady here, since you're sitting near each other, so you can, 2 questions. Go ahead. You go first. You go first.
Yeah. So, sort of looking back over the past 10 years, how much of the 2016 election in like the upper Midwest and with the white working class specifically was Trumpism, and how much was it just them becoming Republican gradually, like with the election of governors and senators and representatives in these areas?
Okay. One more question here while the mic's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks. You spoke very powerfully, Dr. Murray, about what the next 50 to 75 years could look like for men and just the burdens that are being placed on them. I guess my question is, what does that mean for women if we're looking at marriage falling apart, if we're looking at the possibility that they could be economic mainstays of their families if they have this higher level of conscientiousness? Thanks.
Why don't you take the first one?
Okay.
Because I'm not a good political analyst at all.
You want to go first on the second one? Yeah.
No, I want to think about
Okay.
what I want to say. But,
I mean, look, Trump obviously jumbled the map and did better among working class voters, but I'm sympathetic to what I take to be the implicit thrust of your question, which is people are overdoing the specialness of Trump. I mean, Trump got 1% more, if I'm not mistaken, of the white vote than Romney got. I mean, and I think just a couple of percent more of the white working class vote across the country. The trend's been going a long time. Here's a fact. 90%, 91, 92, it's a little hard to know, and especially if you adjust for people who've died and between elections and people who came into the electorate, 18, 19, 20-year-olds between election, about 91, 92% of Trump voters voted for Romney. So it's not like there were huge numbers of people. No, 7 or 8% is not nothing, incidentally. He did win voters. I met some myself when I was out in Cleveland at the Republican convention. I thought this was a canary in the coal mine, and I didn't interpret it well. A young woman who was waiting on us at a kind of a bar, grill type place near the convention in Cleveland. We were having lunch, hamburger and beer sort of thing. A very nice young woman. I don't know, we got struck up a conversation with her for some reason, and she seemed to be, we didn't pry obviously, seemed to be a single mom with 2 kids. She was really looking forward to going to Disney World with the extra money she was making that week off of the Republican convention in Cleveland. It didn't sound like there was a father or husband in the picture, but nice, working hard, obviously, at this job in a bar, to support her kids and to support herself. I got the impression she was maybe late 20s, so her first election was probably 2008. Voted for Obama. She said she'd voted for Obama. I think she said twice, but certainly in the most recent election. Because she didn't like McCain, he was so old, and Romney was so rich, and Obama, there was hope. She wasn't following politics extremely closely, I would say, but she was an average voter. But she was pro-Trump. And I remember, I said this on TV a couple times the next week, and then you sort of lose track of this, and then you start looking at the polls, and you think, well, Hillary will probably win. But I remember thinking, geez, what if there actually are, and this is Ohio, right? It's a battleground state. And in fact, Trump won Ohio by 9 points when Romney had lost it by 5. So that is a pretty massive swing. So in that respect, the national data can conceal real movement. So Trump did do something with the white working class, especially in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, which he didn't quite carry, the states that were most economically disadvantaged over the last 20, 30 years compared to other states. And so I think I think the Trump phenomenon is pretty real, exaggerated, probably. And at the end of the day, he got 46% of the vote, which is a little bit less than Romney had gotten. Lost the popular vote by almost 3 million. Romney lost it by about 4.5 or 5. So one can overdo the earthquake character of the Trump victory. But final point, he pulled an inside straight. He won the right states. It's kind of flukish what happened. But flukes matter in history, right? I mean, proving that Trump didn't have to win or was lucky to win, which I think is a true statement, actually, had a very weak candidate against him and so forth. Proving all that doesn't prove that his actual presidency couldn't have great consequences. World War I was kind of a fluky thing to have happened. It took a whole bunch of random events that didn't have to happen the way they did. But once this happens, it sort of changes the world. And that's the real interesting question for me about the Trump presidency. So that's a separate issue.
Okay, now I've had enough time to figure out.
That's why I went on. I filibustered a little there for Charles' sake.
All right. I am completely departing from any connection with data at this point. I'm going to be giving you some very personal opinions that I have about, but I think are relevant to thinking about the future. let's suppose that a couple of things are true, and I think that these things are true. And one is that a good marriage is about the best thing that can happen to you. It is a source of deeper and longer satisfaction. It's the best way to have a deeply meaningful, intimate relationship. And I think that the recognition of that, I believe that to be a true statement. I'm 1 for 1, but you 1 for 2, but you only have to do it right once, actually, to make it work. That reality, I think, is still in a lot of people's minds, women and men's alike. And despite all the ways in which people don't commit to marriage now and the rest of that, I think that's a kind of a fundamental truth that is a resource for the resuscitation of marriage. And the other thing that I think a lot of people recognize across ideological positions is, a child really needs 2 parents committed to its care. It's really a lot better for the child if the child has that. That's another truth. Now, here comes the third truth that is probably going to irritate a lot of women in the room, and that is that it's not fair, but men largely respond to the expectations of women. And let me put it bluntly. If men can get all the sex they want without any commitment, they will tend to do so. If women demand more out of men, if, as a woman evaluates a man that she might consider getting into a relationship with, if she is evaluating whether she should do that on the basis of, is this a man that I would like to be the father of my children? And if the answer is no, then saying, well, I really don't want to hang out with guys like that, then you will have a change in expectations on men, and the behavior of men will change as well. I am not saying that's fair. I'm saying that's real. And that's been true throughout history, that men respond to the expectations of women, but it's especially true in a free society. In a society before women had any rights and the rest of that, men could get away with an awful lot just by coercion. But in a free society, in a time when women have the independence they have now, women's expectations of men are a really big deal. And I don't think it's out of the question those expectations will change. And that they will change because of those 2 ground truths. That a good marriage really is something that is deeply to be desired, and that children really, really do need 2 parents.
I think we should end on that deep and thought-provoking, and I think somewhat optimistic, would you say, thought?
Let's go for it, yeah.
Okay, good. Rachel has something to say here, I think. So.
Thank you both so much for coming and speaking with us tonight.
Pleasure.
If any of you are undergraduate students or are interested in continuing these kinds of conversations, Dr. Charles Murray will be teaching a course with our summer honors program. A lot of you received flyers as you came in, and we also have some more flyers at the registration table if you want to learn more. Thank you all for coming tonight, and we invite you to stay for a reception right outside these doors.
Good work. That was a great ending. Yeah, it was good.